I am Julian, and I am 28 years old. Exactly 10 years ago, my own parents threw me out onto the freezing concrete street in the dead of winter just because my older brother Silas could not stand the sight of me. While I was standing there shivering in a thin hoodie, staring at my entire 18 years of existence packed carelessly into flimsy cardboard boxes and black trash bags, begging them to at least let me grab my heavy winter coat, my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "We trusted you, and you stabbed us in the back." My father literally slammed the heavy oak front door right in my face, the sound echoing through our quiet neighborhood. And right through the large living room window, I could clearly see my older brother Silas standing by the fireplace. He was looking right at me, wearing this incredibly smug, victorious smirk that is permanently burned into my memory. But there is one massive thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea that the very family business they threw me away to protect was eventually going to fall right into my hands through a blind private equity fund. And right now, all these years later, they are the ones sitting across from me in my high-rise corporate office, completely surrounded by my legal team, crying real tears and begging me not to liquidate their entire lives and leave them with absolutely nothing. Before I tell you exactly how all of that incredible justice unfolded, hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts, no matter how much time passes. And please do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything to me. Now, let us go all the way back to the very beginning, to the exact moment this absolute nightmare started. I can still feel the biting, bitter cold of that Tuesday night. I was just 18 years old, a senior in high school trying to figure out my place in the world. I remember exhausted walking up the long asphalt driveway of the house I grew up in. It was a standard two-story suburban home in a neighborhood where everyone cared way too much about HOA rules, perfectly manicured green lawns, and keeping up the illusion of the perfect American family. It was the kind of place where people smiled sweetly at you in the aisles of the local Walmart, but viciously gossiped about your divorce or your secret financial struggles the exact second you turned your back. I had just finished a grueling 8-hour shift at my part-time job at a local diner. My feet were throbbing. My cheap polyester uniform smelled strongly of stale coffee and old frying grease, and all I desperately wanted was to take a hot shower, eat whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and study for my final history exams. Instead, I walked up the concrete steps to our covered front porch and found my entire existence neatly boxed up and stacked unceremoniously by the front welcome mat. At first, my exhausted teenage brain simply could not process what I was looking at. I genuinely thought maybe my mom was finally getting around to donating old clothes to a charity drive. But then the motion sensor porch light flickered on, illuminating the mess. I saw my middle school debate trophies sticking awkwardly out of a taped-up liquor store box. I saw my favorite worn-out sneakers sitting directly on top of another box. I saw my history textbooks, my favorite bedding, my winter jackets, and even my personal childhood photo album stuffed haphazardly into heavy-duty black trash bags like they were actual garbage. A cold, heavy dread washed over me, chilling me far deeper than the December wind ever could. When I put my house key into the lock, it simply would not turn. The heavy deadbolt was engaged from the inside. I knocked softly at first, thinking it was a mistake. I waited. Nothing happened. Then I pounded on the heavy wooden door, my knuckles stinging sharply from the hard impact. When the door finally swung open, I was not met with confusion or a simple parental misunderstanding. I was met with a solid wall of pure, unadulterated hostility. My father, Richard, stood there filling the doorway. His face was flushed red with absolute rage, the thick veins in his neck bulging aggressively as he gripped a thick stack of freshly printed papers in his right hand. My mother, Martha, was standing right behind his shoulder. Her arms were tightly crossed over her chest, and she was shaking her head slowly, looking at me with an expression of pure, concentrated disgust, exactly as if I were a dangerous criminal who had just broken into her sanctuary. And then there was Silas, my older brother, the absolute undisputed golden child of the family, standing safely off to the side in the warm hallway. His arms were casually resting on the expensive granite kitchen island they had just remodeled. He was completely enjoying the show, soaking in my visible panic like it was his favorite television program. I asked them what was going on, my voice shaking from the cold and the fear. I pointed a trembling finger at the boxes and asked why all my personal things were outside in the freezing temperature. My father did not utter a single word at first. He just stepped forward heavily and violently shoved the thick stack of papers right into my chest, forcing me to grab them awkwardly before they scattered away in the winter wind. He ordered me to explain myself immediately. I looked down at the papers, completely disoriented, the dim yellow porch light barely illuminating the black text. And that was the exact, precise moment my entire reality shifted on its axis. I was officially kicked out of the house, stripped of my family, and rendered homeless because of a complete, fabricated lie. But to truly understand how my own flesh and blood could discard me like worthless trash over a fabricated piece of paper, you have to deeply understand the intensely toxic dynamic of our household. You have to understand Silas. I want you to take a moment and think about the most spoiled, entitled, deeply narcissistic person you have ever crossed paths with in your entire life. Now multiply that horrible personality by 100. Give him an endless supply of parental validation, and you have my brother Silas. From the exact moment I was born, it was painfully, undeniably clear that Silas was the burning bright center of my parents' universe, and I was merely a background character, an annoying afterthought in his grand, spectacular production. If Silas got a simple B- on a basic high school math test, my parents would treat the event like he had just single-handedly cured a major global disease. They would proudly take us all out to an expensive downtown steakhouse to loudly celebrate his incredible, unmatched hard work. If I brought home a pristine report card with straight A's in advanced placement classes, my mother would barely glance at the paper before handing it back and sharply telling me to go take out the kitchen trash or mow the back lawn before it got dark. It was never just empty verbal praise. It was an extreme, sickening disparity in actual financial resources. They poured every single ounce of their energy, their love, and their financial stability into him. I remember vividly when my grandfather passed away. After the somber funeral, there was a reading of his will, and my parents received a fairly substantial inheritance. They did not put that money into a joint family savings account or a secure 401k for their retirement. They used a massive chunk of that inheritance money to buy Silas a brand new, highly expensive sports car for his 16th birthday. Meanwhile, I was given a bus pass and took the unreliable public city bus to school every single day in the pouring rain and the freezing snow. They completely drained the family college fund to eagerly pay for his extremely overpriced tuition at a top-tier private business school. They enthusiastically paid the exorbitant rent for his luxury off-campus apartment, his ridiculously expensive fraternity dues, and his lavish weekend trips to the beach, tapping deeply into their own personal retirement accounts and long-term savings to flawlessly fund his lavish, party-heavy lifestyle. Silas would brag loudly at Thanksgiving dinners about getting a fake, nepotism promotion at his lazy summer internship, and they would immediately buy him a designer watch to celebrate his corporate brilliance. I grew up with the heavy, deeply suffocating mentality that it simply did not matter what I achieved, because Silas would always vastly outshine me in their eyes. I actively kept my head down. I did my assigned household chores perfectly without ever complaining. I got my top-tier grades. I worked my exhausting diner job to pay for my own clothes and school supplies. I tried incredibly hard to be as invisible, self-sufficient, and low-maintenance as humanly possible. I honestly thought if I did not ask for a single thing, if I never caused a financial problem, at least they would not actively resent my presence in their house. I foolishly thought if I played by all the rules, eventually, they would wake up and see my intrinsic value as their son. But absolutely everything changed the week I received my college acceptance letters. Against all the odds stacked against me, working late-night diner shifts smelling like grease, and studying my history books on the bumpy, loud bus rides home, I got accepted into a highly reputable, internationally prestigious university in the United Kingdom to study history. It was my absolute ultimate dream. It was my golden ticket out of that toxic suburban house and permanently out of Silas's suffocating, dark shadow. I did not expect a parade. I did not expect a new car with a giant red bow or a fancy celebration dinner. I just wanted a fighting chance at a real, independent life. I sat at the wooden kitchen table, holding that thick, heavy acceptance letter with shaking hands, foolishly thinking that maybe, just maybe, this would finally be the moment my parents looked at me with genuine, unadulterated pride. I was so incredibly wrong. When I proudly showed them the official acceptance letter from the UK university, there was absolutely no celebration. There was not even a polite smile. There was just a thick, incredibly uncomfortable silence that instantly filled the kitchen air. My dad adjusted his reading glasses, looked at the fancy crest printed on the heavy paper, and carelessly tossed it back onto the table like it was a piece of junk mail. My mom did not even bother to read it. She just continued aggressively wiping down the granite countertops with a damp sponge, refusing to make eye contact with me. I eagerly, desperately explained that I had already secured a partial academic scholarship based on my grades, but I still desperately needed financial help with the remaining tuition balance and basic living expenses for the very first year abroad. I made it abundantly, explicitly clear that I was not asking them to drain their bank accounts or sacrifice their lifestyle. I just needed them to formally co-sign a standard student loan. Just a simple signature on a piece of legal paper. That was literally all it took for me to build my entire future and leave their house forever. My parents straight up looked at me and told me they absolutely could not afford my tuition. My father leaned back heavily in his dining chair, firmly crossed his arms over his chest, and delivered the devastating blow without a single hint of fatherly emotion or regret. He explicitly stated that they had already paid entirely for Silas's college out of pocket, and now they had to selfishly think about their own financial future. He claimed they were currently planning to start a brand new small logistics business around that time, and all their liquid savings and available credit were being aggressively funneled into that risky startup venture. I was desperate. I begged them. I explained with tears welling in my eyes that without a parental cosigner, the bank would absolutely not approve a large international student loan for an 18-year-old kid with a part-time diner income. I promised them I would immediately take on a second job the moment I landed in the UK. I promised I would live in the absolute cheapest, smallest dorm room available on campus. I swore on my life I would pay every single dime back to the bank the exact moment I graduated and secured a professional salary. I even gently, cautiously reminded them of the massive college fund they had entirely drained for Silas, who was currently coasting lazily through his business school classes with mediocre grades, eagerly spending their hard-earned money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and wild fraternity parties. That was a massive mistake. My mother immediately cut me off, her face twisting in anger. She used that soft, deeply manipulative, intense guilt-tripping tone she always perfected when she wanted to shut me down and make me feel like an absolute monster. She pointed a wet finger at me and told me I was being incredibly selfish, jealous, and ungrateful for even daring to bring up Silas's personal finances. She looked at me with absolute disdain and said that Silas's business degree was a critical, high-yield investment in the family's future, while my history degree in a foreign country was just a ridiculous, highly expensive personal hobby. She actually looked her youngest son in the eyes and called his entire future career a hobby. They flat out refused to help me, and we fought bitterly about it for days. But it was a completely losing battle from the start. They had absolutely no problem whatsoever spending tens of thousands of dollars on Silas's lavish, unnecessary lifestyle, but when it came to my basic education and my entire future, suddenly they had to be incredibly frugal, highly responsible, and strictly practical. I was completely stuck. I felt the physical walls of that house rapidly closing in on me. I watched the strict deadline to formally accept my university admission slowly creeping closer on the calendar hanging in my bedroom. I was losing sleep, paralyzed by the intense, suffocating fear that I would be permanently trapped in that small town, working double shifts at the diner forever, watching Silas eventually inherit absolutely everything they owned. I knew I had to take drastic matters into my own hands if I wanted to survive. That is exactly when I thought of Aunt Vivian. Aunt Vivian is my dad's older sister, and she is an absolute force of nature. She is a brilliant, highly respected neurosurgeon with an incredibly high salary. She is wealthy, fiercely independent, and she owns an impressive, highly lucrative real estate portfolio across the entire state. She is also widely considered the absolute black sheep of our family, simply because she never once put up with my father's toxic nonsense, his constant complaining, and his deep patriarchal complexes. My parents always maintained this weird, incredibly uncomfortable, thick tension with her at every single Thanksgiving dinner and holiday gathering. They would put on fake, tight smiles, compliment her expensive clothes, and act perfectly polite to her face. But the exact moment her luxury car pulled out of the driveway, the bitter, venomous whispers from my father would immediately start. My dad, in particular, absolutely hated feeling like she completely overshadowed him in every conceivable way. He deeply, bitterly resented her massive salary, her sharp intelligence, her beautiful custom-built home, and the effortless, confident way she always carried herself in a room. He felt deeply emasculated by her massive financial success. I knew perfectly well that reaching out to her was a massive, dangerous risk. If my dad ever found out I was secretly asking his highly successful sister for financial help, it would completely shatter his fragile, pathetic ego, and he would direct all his furious, explosive wrath directly at me. But I was backed completely into a dark corner. I had absolutely zero other options left. So, one rainy afternoon while they were out grocery shopping, I firmly locked my bedroom door, sat on the edge of my bed, and dialed her personal number. My heart was pounding entirely out of my chest when she finally answered the phone. I poured my entire heart out to her over the line. I told her absolutely everything about the UK university acceptance, the partial scholarship I earned, and my parents' absolute, stubborn refusal to simply co-sign a basic student loan. I fully expected her to lecture me about family loyalty, or tell me to respect my parents' financial boundaries and go to a local community college instead. Instead, she did not even hesitate for a single second. Her voice was incredibly warm, steady, and full of authority. She told me, "Of course I will help you, Julian. Why on earth didn't you come to me sooner?" She did not just offer to co-sign the miserable bank loan. She firmly insisted on paying the remaining tuition balance completely directly from her own private accounts. She told me she had watched me grow up, she saw how they treated me, and she believed in my intelligence and my immense drive. For the very first time in my entire 18 years of life, an adult in my own family looked at my raw potential and definitively decided it was worth investing real money in. I was completely overwhelmed with a profound, tearful sense of gratitude, but I was also absolutely terrified of the inevitable family fallout. I practically begged Aunt Vivian to keep our financial arrangement a strict, absolute secret. I explicitly told her that if my dad knew I went behind his back to ask his highly successful sister for money, he would completely lose his mind and probably ban me from leaving the house altogether. She understood the toxic family dynamics perfectly. We firmly agreed to keep it strictly between us until I was safely on an international plane to the UK, thousands of miles away from his toxic control. For a few glorious, peaceful weeks, everything was absolutely perfect. The large tuition bill was paid directly to the university via a wire transfer, my international student visa was officially approved, and I started secretly packing my suitcases late at night when everyone was asleep. I walked around the house feeling lighter than air, actually smiling to myself while doing the dinner dishes. I was finally, truly going to escape. But in my naive, youthful happiness, I made one fatal, life-altering mistake. I severely, dangerously underestimated how deeply Silas despised seeing me succeed, and exactly how far he would maliciously go to destroy me before I could leave. It happened during a casual, seemingly normal family barbecue on a sunny Sunday afternoon. The backyard smelled heavily like charcoal and grilled burgers. My cousin Oscar, a weak-willed, incredibly nosy guy who always desperately wanted to be included in Silas's elite inner circle, had come over to hang out. I had foolishly left my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter for just a single minute while I ran out into the hot garage to grab a heavy bag of ice for the cooler. I did not know it then, but an email notification from Aunt Vivian had popped up brightly on my home screen, directly discussing the final international wire transfer for my tuition and warmly wishing me a safe flight to London. Oscar, being the incredibly nosy opportunist he is, walked by and saw it. And Oscar, desperately wanting to score massive loyalty points with the family golden child, ran straight out to the backyard patio and whispered to Silas exactly what he saw on my screen. Silas did not confront me right then and there. That was never his style. Silas was a calculating coward who liked to absolutely destroy people methodically from the shadows. To this very day, I still do not know exactly how he managed it, but later that exact same week, when I was completely exhausted at my long diner shift, he broke into my private room and got into my personal laptop. He went ruthlessly, methodically digging through my personal files, my private browser history, and my secure email accounts. When he finally found the specific email chain between Aunt Vivian and me discussing the massive tuition payment, he did not just read them. He weaponized them with terrifying sociopathic precision. Being the deeply manipulative sociopath that he is, Silas could not just let the situation go or simply tell my parents the truth about the college money. He knew perfectly well that simply telling my dad that Aunt Vivian was paying for my college would certainly cause a massive, explosive fight, but it would absolutely not be enough to ruin my life permanently. My dad might yell at me, but secretly, he would ultimately be incredibly glad he did not have to spend a single dime of his own money on my education. Silas absolutely did not want just a fight. He wanted me completely, permanently eradicated from the family tree. He wanted to ensure that he remained the sole heir, the only son who mattered, the only one who would ever receive their money, their real estate, and their eventual life insurance payouts. So, he aggressively took those private emails, maliciously imported them into a photo editing software on his expensive computer, and meticulously started rewriting reality. He spent hours fabricating incredibly detailed, fake email exchanges between Aunt Vivian and me, making it look exactly like I was actively, maliciously betraying the family. My parents had been loudly and constantly discussing their grand plans for their new startup over dinner every single night. A niche logistics company they were utterly, blindly convinced would make them millions of dollars in their retirement. Silas masterfully doctored the emails to make it look like I was systematically leaking their highly confidential business plans, their sensitive financial growth strategies, and their prospective private vendor lists directly to Aunt Vivian. He carefully crafted the fake messages to make it look perfectly like I was actively selling out my own parents, illegally trading their precious business secrets in exchange for Aunt Vivian paying my expensive foreign tuition. It was a terrifying, brilliant masterclass in psychological manipulation. It was so completely unhinged, so deeply psychopathic, that normal, rational parents would have immediately questioned its authenticity. They would have looked closely at the weird formatting, or demanded to see the live emails on the actual computer server. But my parents were not normal. They were deeply paranoid about their money, and they worshipped the literal ground Silas walked on. If Silas said the sky was green, they would paint their ceiling to match. Which brings me right back to that freezing Tuesday night on the porch, staring in absolute horror at the thick stack of printed papers my father had just violently shoved into my chest. I stood there shivering uncontrollably in my thin diner sweater, looking closely at the printed pages. My eyes rapidly scanned the bold words, and total panic immediately set in. The specific formatting of the emails was slightly off. The vocabulary used in my supposed replies did not sound absolutely anything like my natural voice, and the entire premise was completely, fundamentally absurd. Why on earth would Aunt Vivian, a highly successful, multi-millionaire medical professional with zero background in shipping, care about stealing a small-town logistics startup plan from a brother she barely even spoke to? It made zero logical or financial sense. I frantically tried to explain to them that it was all entirely fake, that Silas must have maliciously doctored them to frame me. I pointed a shaking, frozen finger at the glaring, obvious technical flaws in the printed text. I begged my father to let me inside for just 5 minutes to grab my laptop, to pull up the real, live, authentic emails on the secure server to definitively prove my innocence. I pleaded with them with tears streaming down my freezing face to use just one single ounce of common sense. But they did not even listen. They absolutely did not want to listen. My mother aggressively stepped forward into the cold air and just kept crying these massive, dramatic, highly theatrical crocodile tears. She tightly clutched her chest like she was having a heart attack and loudly wailed that I had completely broken her heart, that I was a deceitful, evil snake who had ruthlessly plotted against their financial future. My dad stood there puffing his chest out to intimidate me, his face contorted with ugly rage, loudly yelling that I was a disgusting traitor to my own blood. It simply did not matter what logical arguments I made, what undeniable logic I presented, or how hard I cried on that porch, because they always unconditionally believed Silas. He was the golden child. In their deeply twisted, delusional minds, Silas was the heroic, loyal son, desperately trying to protect the family empire from their evil, backstabbing, jealous younger son. Silas just stood there the entire time, casually leaning against the warm doorframe inside, watching my entire life completely fall apart with a sick, twisted sense of deep satisfaction. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was permanently, legally eliminating his only competition for the inheritance. He was ensuring that every cent of their future wealth, every ounce of their attention, and their entire estate would remain exclusively his forever. I begged them to please reconsider their actions. The winter wind was howling, and I was freezing to the bone. I told them I had absolutely nowhere to go, that I did not want to be a sudden, massive burden on Aunt Vivian before I even left for school. I asked them where I was supposed to sleep that very night in the freezing cold. My dad just pointed a rigid, shaking finger down the dark driveway toward the icy street. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred and told me to take my garbage boxes and get off his property right that exact second before he called the police and had me formally arrested for criminal trespassing. He told me I was dead to him, that he had no second son. That was exactly it. 18 years of my life, 18 years of trying desperately to be the perfect, quiet, invisible, zero-maintenance son, completely wiped out in 5 minutes by a photoshopped, malicious lie. I slowly, painfully dragged my heavy cardboard boxes to the icy street curb. I had to call an Uber on my phone because, unlike the golden child Silas, I did not have a car. I sat on the freezing concrete curb for 20 agonizing minutes, watching the warm, golden light glowing from the large windows of my childhood home. I realized in that dark moment that the people who brought me into this world did not actually love me at all. They only loved the highly convenient version of reality where Silas was an absolute king, and I was a worthless peasant to be casually discarded when I was no longer compliant. When the Uber finally arrived, the driver looked at me with deep, silent pity. I loaded my heavy trash bags into the trunk of a complete stranger's car and gave the driver Aunt Vivian's address. I left that toxic house with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on my back, a few pathetic boxes of memories, and a completely irreparably shattered heart. When I finally arrived at Aunt Vivian's beautiful, sprawling custom house in the highly upscale part of town, it was well past midnight. I rang the doorbell, shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering loudly. She quickly opened the door in her expensive silk robe, took one single look at my tear-stained, freezing face, saw the pathetic, wet cardboard boxes sitting in her pristine driveway, and did not ask a single judgmental question. She did not interrogate me or ask for my side of the story. She just immediately reached out, grabbed my freezing arm, and pulled me forcefully inside into the incredible warmth of her home. She helped me bring my heavy things inside, completely ignoring the fact that my wet, snowy shoes were tracking mud all over her incredibly expensive hardwood floors. She did not pry into the painful details. She just saw that I was hurting deeply, and she told me firmly that her large house was my house for as absolutely long as I needed to stay. That kind of profound, unconditional kindness hit me right in the gut like a physical punch. I sat at her massive granite kitchen island, gripping a hot cup of herbal tea to warm my freezing, blue hands, and I finally broke down completely. I sobbed so hard my chest physically ached. I realized right then, crying heavily in my aunt's kitchen, that I had never, ever felt anything close to that kind of unconditional safety, warmth, and protection from my own parents. Living with Aunt Vivian over the next few critical weeks before my international flight was completely surreal, exactly like waking up in a strange, peaceful alternate dimension. It was deeply, wonderfully strange waking up every morning in her pristine, beautifully decorated guest room, realizing that I absolutely did not have to walk on eggshells anymore. I did not have to constantly lower my voice, hide my academic accomplishments, or fear being randomly yelled at. Over time, as the initial brutal shock slowly wore off, we started getting much closer, and we started having long, deeply honest conversations over coffee about the harsh, ugly reality of my family's history. Aunt Vivian was incredibly sharp, highly observant, and she knew a lot more about my parents and their deep-rooted generational dysfunction than I ever realized. She had quietly watched the entire disaster unfold for decades. One quiet evening, we were sitting out on her enclosed, heated patio, looking out at the falling snow, and she told me something that completely, fundamentally shifted my entire perspective on my father's intense hatred toward her and me. My dad's massive grudge against her did not just start simply because she was a highly successful female doctor who vastly out-earned him. It was deeply rooted in an old, bitter, unforgivable business betrayal. She revealed to me that the brilliant, supposedly millionaire-making business plan my parents were so incredibly paranoid about me leaking, it was originally her specific idea. Years ago, Aunt Vivian had drafted a comprehensive, highly detailed, professionally researched plan for a medical supply logistics company. She had shared the documents with my dad in strict confidence, hoping to generously bring him in as a managing partner to handle the daily operations. Instead of working with her fairly and legally, my father tried to secretly steal the vendor contacts and launch the business himself entirely behind her back. He failed miserably because he completely lacked the intense work ethic, the raw intelligence, and the actual capital to pull it off. Now, all these years later, he was pathetically trying to resurrect that exact same stolen idea with Silas, foolishly funding it with their entire life savings and retirement money. Aunt Vivian looked at me calmly and explained that his raging paranoia was not actually about me betraying him at all. It was a massive, textbook psychological projection of his own intense, unresolved guilt. He absolutely hated Aunt Vivian because her very existence, her massive wealth, and her high status constantly reminded him of his own mediocrity and his past ethical failures. And he hated me because he saw clearly that I possessed the genuine ambition, the raw intelligence, and the strong moral compass that he so desperately, painfully wanted for Silas, but deeply knew Silas lacked. Knowing this profound, ugly truth did not magically make the intense pain of parental abandonment go away, but it made it finally manageable. It stopped being a reflection of my personal worth and finally started being a glaring reflection of their overwhelming, incurable toxicity. I was not thrown out because I was a bad son. I was thrown out because my very existence threatened their fragile, carefully constructed delusions. Days slowly turned into quiet weeks, and a pathetic, deeply ingrained part of me kept waiting for my parents to call. I kept obsessively checking my cell phone, foolishly hoping for a sudden, tearful apology, hoping my mother's conscience had finally kicked in, or hoping for even just a simple text asking if I was safe and alive. But there was absolutely nothing. Not a single call. Not a single text message. The silence was absolute. The silence was deafening. They had completely erased me from their lives like I never existed. The exact day before my scheduled international flight to the UK, my phone finally buzzed. My heart violently leapt into my throat. But it was not an apology. It was a text message from Silas. It was a cruel, obnoxious, deeply arrogant taunt. He wrote, "Hope you're doing okay. By the way, don't leave your laptop lying around." He was deliberately, maliciously rubbing it in. He was explicitly letting me know that he got away with his sociopathic crime, that he had officially won the sick family game, and that I was utterly, permanently defeated. I stared at the bright screen, feeling my blood boil, my hands shaking with a rage so intense I felt physically sick. But I did not reply. Giving him a dramatic reaction was exactly what his narcissistic brain wanted. I permanently blocked his number from my phone. A few hours later, I got a text message from my dad. It was incredibly short, freezing cold, and entirely devoid of any fatherly emotion whatsoever. It just said, "Good luck in the UK." No logical explanation, no emotional apology, no loving goodbye, just a sterile, heartless dismissal. exactly like a cold corporate boss firing an intern via email. I stared at the message, completely numb. Then, I deleted the message and blocked his number too. I blocked my mother's number. I severed the digital cords completely. When Aunt Vivian drove me to the busy international airport the very next morning, the winter sun was finally shining brightly. We stood together at the security departure gate, and she hugged me tightly, holding on to me for a long, quiet time. She looked me directly in the eyes and told me how incredibly proud she was of my resilience, and how she knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that I would do great things in this world. Hearing those genuine, powerful words of affirmation from someone in my family gave me the final push of extreme courage I desperately needed. I walked purposefully through airport security, and with every single step I took away from my hometown, the heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family lifted off my shoulders. I got on that massive plane knowing I was leaving my old, pathetic life completely behind. I decided right then and there, looking out the airplane window as we took off into the clouds, that I simply did not need them anymore. I was completely done seeking their conditional approval. I was going to the UK, I was going to get my degree, and I was going to build an empire of my own so massive, so financially undeniable, that they would eventually have to look up just to see my shadow. I honestly thought the worst was finally over. I truly thought the storm was behind me and I could just move on with my adult life in total peace. I was so incredibly, dangerously wrong. Because years later, the dark past did not just knock softly on my door. It tried to aggressively kick it down with a massive corporate lawsuit, a total financial collapse, and a desperate, pathetic plea for mercy. The passage of time is a funny thing when you are actively trying to outrun your own traumatic history. Fast forward 3 entire years from that freezing night on the porch. The years I spent living and studying in the United Kingdom were an absolute masterclass in sheer survival and calculated reinvention. I did not just attend my university classes. I completely devoured them. I practically lived inside the historic stone walls of the university library, completely surrounding myself with towering stacks of history texts, global economic theory books, and corporate law journals. I settled into the grueling academic college life with a burning, relentless determination that bordered on obsession. I made genuine, lifelong friends who did not care a single bit about my family's toxic history, my lack of a trust fund, or the fact that I spent every holiday break working instead of flying home. For the very first time in my entire existence, I was not constantly, obsessively thinking about Silas or my parents. I completely threw myself into my demanding studies, ultimately graduating at the absolute top of my class with highest honors. Instead of pursuing a quiet life in academia, I aggressively pivoted into the high-stakes, cutthroat world of international finance and corporate restructuring. I networked relentlessly and eventually secured a massive, highly coveted promotion at a prestigious, ruthless private equity firm based in London. I was earning an annual salary and corporate bonuses that my arrogant father simply could not have comprehended in his wildest, most delusional financial dreams. I was officially a senior investment director, personally handling distressed corporate portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I bought prime, highly lucrative real estate properties to build my personal wealth. I wore impeccably tailored, expensive suits. I built a brand new life of complete, absolute financial security and professional power. Eventually, due to my aggressive success in corporate liquidations, my firm transferred me back to the United States to personally manage a newly acquired corporate branch in a major metropolitan city, situated just a few hours away from my miserable hometown. I came back to my home country a completely different man than the freezing, terrified teenager who had fled. I was confident, financially untouchable, and emotionally detached from the deep trauma of my past. I found an incredibly high-paying executive job, comfortably settling into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse apartment that completely overlooked the glittering downtown skyline. My building had strict HOA rules, massive security personnel, and private elevators. I was completely insulated from the ugly world I left behind. I genuinely thought I was entirely invisible to them. I thought I had successfully scrubbed my existence from their radar. But of course, just when things were going perfectly smoothly, just when I was finalizing a massive corporate lawsuit regarding a corporate buyout, the ugly past had to crawl out of the swamp and try to mess everything up. It all started on a random, rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting comfortably in my quiet home office, surrounded by polished mahogany and expensive art, reviewing a massive stack of real estate acquisition files, when my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the desk. I casually glanced at the bright screen. The caller ID displayed a local area code and a specific phone number I had not seen in years. It was a number I explicitly thought I had permanently blocked from my life, but it must have somehow slipped through the digital cracks when I recently upgraded my international phone plan and transferred my digital contacts. It was my mother. Yes, my mother. The exact same woman who stood on that freezing, icy porch with her arms crossed and watched me get violently thrown into the dark streets. The woman who had not spoken a single solitary word to me since the absolute worst day of my life. The call was completely, utterly unexpected. I sat frozen in my leather office chair, staring intently at the glowing screen, my heart momentarily skipping a harsh beat against my ribs. My analytical mind instantly started racing with a million chaotic questions. Should I answer it? Should I just hit ignore and permanently delete the number? After absolutely everything that had happened, after the ultimate unforgivable family betrayal, why on earth would she be calling me now? I let the phone ring a few more times. I watched it vibrate aggressively against the polished wood of my desk. Then, entirely against my better professional judgment and my own established boundaries, I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, intentionally keeping my voice completely flat, strictly businesslike, and completely devoid of any warm emotion, trying hard to sound incredibly calm even though my pulse was pounding loudly in my ears. There was a long, heavy, suffocating pause on the other end of the secure line, exactly like she was not entirely sure what to say, or perhaps she was deeply shocked that I actually answered the phone instead of sending her straight to a cold voicemail. Finally, she spoke into the receiver. "Hi, it is your mother," she said, her voice shaking slightly, laced with an artificial, practiced vulnerability. "No kidding. Who else in the world would it be?" I did not say that sarcastic thought out loud, though. I just stayed completely, terrifyingly quiet, letting the heavy, uncomfortable dead air stretch endlessly between us, forcing her to do the heavy lifting, waiting for her to awkwardly explain exactly why she felt entitled to call my private number after almost 3 years of absolute, unforgivable silence. She hesitated again, the silence stretching uncomfortably, and then out of nowhere, she deployed that classic, highly manipulative tone she always used when she wanted something for nothing and said, "We really need to talk, Julian." I physically could not help but scoff loudly directly into the receiver. Now she suddenly wanted to talk? After she willingly let Silas doctor those fake emails? After she completely erased me from her family tree to protect her golden child? It was so predictably, pathetically typical of her behavioral patterns. But even though I was deeply, profoundly annoyed by her sheer audacity, a small, dark, calculating part of my brain was morbidly curious. What could possibly be so incredibly important that she was reaching out after all this time? About what exactly? I asked bluntly, keeping my tone as brutally neutral and unyielding as a brick wall. Your father and I, we really want to see you," she said, deliberately stumbling over her chosen words like she was trying incredibly hard to figure out how to phrase her request perfectly to hook my lingering childhood emotions. I could already see the exact trajectory of where this highly manipulative conversation was going. They did not actually want to see me because they genuinely missed me, or because they felt a single shred of legitimate parental guilt for kicking me out into the snow. There was something they desperately, urgently needed from me. And considering my recent highly publicized executive promotion and my clear financial success in the corporate world, I had a pretty accurate, cynical guess about exactly what that need was. I sighed heavily, leaning back deep into my expensive leather office chair. "Why?" I asked, completely refusing to give her an inch of emotional ground. She did not answer right away, which pretty much entirely confirmed my absolute worst suspicions about her true motives. When she finally did speak again, her voice was much quieter, deliberately dropping an entire octave like she was trying desperately to sound all motherly, fragile, and deeply concerned about the state of the world. Your dad and we have been going through a really, really hard time recently. Things have not been easy for the business since the pandemic hit the economy, she said, her voice dripping with calculated self-pity. Boom. There it was. The absolute, undeniable, naked truth behind the unexpected phone call. It was exactly what I had cynically thought. Severe money problems. I had not heard much about their grand, supposedly million-dollar logistics startup since I left the country, but Aunt Vivian had briefly mentioned in passing over a holiday dinner that their business was not thriving the way they had so arrogantly expected. And with the massive economic downturn affecting global supply chains, it made perfect, logical sense that they would be struggling to make payroll. But I was absolutely not going to blindly jump in and play the heroic savior. Not after everything they had maliciously, intentionally done to destroy my life. Okay, and what does that have to do with me? I said, my voice turning ice cold. I was absolutely not about to make this pathetic begging routine easy for her. Your brother Silas, he has been managing the financial things for us, but he has run into some bad luck, she started, her voice wavering as she desperately tried to cover for her favorite son. That is exactly when I ruthlessly, sharply cut her off mid-sentence. Let me guess, I said, already knowing the pathetic punchline to this terrible family joke. Silas completely screwed it all up and bankrupted the company. There was a massive, completely deafening pause on her end of the line, which was a loud, clear answer in itself. Of course, the useless golden child had messed it up. I honestly do not know why they were ever surprised by his absolute failure. Silas was always entirely more interested in looking wealthy, driving fast sports cars, showing off at country clubs, and pretending to be a CEO than actually doing any of the grueling, unglamorous hard work required to run a logistics firm. They had foolishly, blindly put all their absolute faith, their entire retirement funds, and their entire financial future securely in his greedy hands, and now it was completely, spectacularly backfiring on them. My mom let out a very long, shaky breath into the phone receiver. Things have not been going exactly as we planned, she finally admitted, the heavy, crushing defeat clearly evident in her aging voice. And we desperately need your financial help, Julian. I laughed. I physically, genuinely could not help it. It was a dark, humorless sound. After absolutely everything, after violently throwing me out of my own home, legally cutting me off from all support, letting Silas deeply manipulate them with fake documents, and leaving me to freeze on a street curb, now they wanted access to my hard-earned corporate salary. The pure, unadulterated audacity of the request was completely, entirely unreal. Unbelievable, I muttered under my breath, shaking my head at the ceiling. What is so funny? My mom asked defensively, sounding genuinely, incredibly confused, exactly like she could not possibly understand why I was not eagerly jumping at the incredible, honorable chance to swoop in, open my massive checkbook, and save the entire family legacy. You are completely serious right now? You actually, genuinely think I am going to help you pay your debts? I said, my voice finally rising in volume, feeling the raw, suppressed anger bubbling up rapidly in my chest. All the intense, painful emotions I had been forcefully pushing down and ignoring for the past few years were rushing violently back to the surface. We are your parents, she pleaded desperately, her voice cracking with forced emotion. We made some mistakes in the past, Julian. But we are family, and we need you right now. I shook my head aggressively, my grip tightening on the expensive phone. You did not just make simple mistakes, Mom. You violently kicked your teenage son out of the house in the dead of winter. You willingly, eagerly believed Silas's sociopathic lies over your own flesh and blood. You have not spoken a single word to me in years, and now you suddenly need my salary to cover your bad investments. And suddenly I am supposed to drop my entire life and come running back to fix your impending bankruptcy. She was completely quiet after that brutal reality check. She literally did not know what to say. She probably was not used to me aggressively standing up for myself and setting incredibly firm, unbreakable boundaries. Back when I was living silently under her toxic roof, I would have just gone along with whatever insane demands they made to keep the fragile peace. But I was not that scared kid anymore. I had fundamentally changed. I possessed massive corporate power now, and I was absolutely not going to let them walk all over me ever again. Finally, she spoke again, but her entire tone had shifted drastically. She immediately dropped the fake, vulnerable, crying mother act. Now she sounded highly irritated, wildly entitled, and deeply bitter, exactly like she could not believe I was being so difficult and uncooperative. "We are still your family," she said sharply, her true, toxic colors bleeding completely through the phone line. "You owe us at least that much respect and financial support for raising you." That was it. That was the final, absolute straw that broke the camel's back. I did not owe them a single, solitary thing in this universe. "I do not owe you a damn thing," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadly whisper. "If you need financial help to save your sinking ship, go ask Silas to sell his expensive toys. He is your perfect golden child. Remember? Let him save you." Without waiting for her toxic, screaming response, I aggressively hung up the phone and threw it onto my desk. My heart was pounding hard against my ribs, but I felt a strange, incredibly powerful sense of absolute, total relief. I had finally said exactly what I needed to say for a decade. But the peace did not last long, because exactly 2 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, I heard a heavy, aggressive knock on the thick mahogany front door of my secure penthouse apartment. I frowned, walked over to the security panel and checked the live camera feed. My blood ran completely, absolutely cold in my veins. Standing out there in my private hallway, looking around nervously at the expensive decor, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, was my brother Silas. I quickly unlocked the heavy deadbolt, grabbed the handle, and yanked the large door open. He jumped slightly backward, clearly startled by my sudden, intimidating appearance. For a long, tense second, he just stood there and stared at me. He looked closely at my expensive tailored casual clothes. He looked past my shoulder at the massive, beautifully decorated luxury apartment, and I could clearly see the intense, burning, ugly jealousy flash across his eyes. "Hey," he said, instantly putting on this incredibly fake, bubbly, overly familiar smile exactly like we were old college buddies meeting up for a drink. "It has been a long while, little brother. What exactly are you doing here, Silas?" I asked sharply, firmly planting my feet and not stepping aside to let him cross the threshold. He immediately tried to charm his slimy way past my arm. "I really wanted to talk to you in person," he said, tilting his head with fake sincerity. "Can I please come inside for just a minute?" I truly wanted to slam the heavy solid wood door directly in his smug face, but a calculating part of my brain wanted to clearly see exactly how desperate and pathetic he had become. I slowly stepped aside. He walked in, greedily taking in the expensive designer furniture, the modern art on the walls, and the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Very nice apartment," he noted enviously, his eyes constantly darting around, clearly calculating exactly how much money I was making to afford this kind of real estate. "Get straight to the point," I snapped harshly, crossing my arms over my chest. He sighed highly dramatically, playing the role of the exhausted, overburdened victim. "Mom told me all about your incredibly harsh conversation on the phone. She is pretty upset with you, you know. I have been trying my absolute best to keep the family business going, but it has been really, really hard. The global pandemic hit our supply chains badly. We are completely on the verge of losing absolutely everything we own. And let me take a wild guess. You want me to generously bail you out with my corporate salary?" I asked, my voice dripping with heavy sarcasm. "I am absolutely not asking for a free handout," he said defensively, holding his hands up. "I just thought we could sit down and figure a business arrangement out together. You are doing incredibly well for yourself. I figured you would naturally want to step up and help save the family legacy." "You figured entirely wrong," I said flatly, staring daggers into him. Not after absolutely everything you maliciously did to me. You completely ruined my life, Silas. You intentionally fabricated those emails. You actively got me kicked out into the freezing snow. And now you genuinely think I am going to write a check to save you from your own incompetence? Absolutely not. He stared at me, genuinely dumbfounded that his manipulation tactics were completely failing. But we are family, he said weakly, using the ultimate toxic buzzword. We permanently stopped being family the exact day you made it your personal mission to destroy my future, I said, pointing straight to the open front door. You made your selfish choices. Now you have to suffer the consequences of your own actions. Get out of my home. He turned entirely pale, finally realizing I was absolutely not the weak, compliant younger brother he could bully anymore. Without uttering another word, he angrily stormed out into the hallway, violently slamming the heavy door behind him. I stood there alone in my quiet apartment, feeling the ultimate total control over my own life. I was finally truly free from his shadow. But little did I know, the real massive confrontation, the ultimate explosive detonation of karma, was waiting just around the corner at my corporate office. It was not even a full week later when the massive, final wave of family drama violently hit the shores of my peaceful new life. This time, it was not just Silas showing up uninvited at my private apartment. It was both my mother and my father, and they did not come to my residential home. In an act of supreme, unbelievable entitlement, they showed up directly at the main front reception desk of my highly secure corporate office building in the center of the financial district. I was sitting quietly in my massive glass-walled corner office, deeply engrossed in going over a major, multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition file, when my highly efficient executive assistant Clara urgently buzzed my private desk intercom. "Mr. Julian," Clara said, her professional voice laced with clear concern. "There are two older individuals currently in the main lobby claiming loudly to be your parents. They are aggressively demanding to see you immediately, and they are starting to cause quite a disruptive scene in front of the other clients." I slowly closed my eyes, taking a very deep, stabilizing breath. I knew exactly what their toxic strategy was. They were purposefully escalating the situation. They wrongly thought that by showing up unannounced at my place of business, they could weaponize public pressure and the severe threat of professional embarrassment to forcefully bend my will. They arrogantly assumed I would panic, quietly pull them into a back room, and quickly write them a massive bailout check just to make them go away and avoid a humiliating family scandal in front of my wealthy corporate colleagues. They were playing a very dangerous, incredibly stupid game of corporate chicken, and they had absolutely no idea they were driving at full speed straight into a reinforced brick wall. "Send them directly up to the main executive conference room on the top floor, Clara," I said smoothly into the intercom, my voice completely devoid of panic. "And please immediately inform Mr. Harrison and Beatrice from the legal department that we are entirely ready to proceed with the final presentation." I calmly stood up from my desk, grabbed a thick, incredibly heavy legal folder containing hundreds of pages of financial documents, and walked with absolute purpose down the long, carpeted hallway. When I forcefully pushed open the heavy double oak doors of the main conference room, my mother and father were already sitting at the massive, polished mahogany table. My dad looked highly uncomfortable and deeply out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern, intimidating corporate environment. My mom had her arms tightly crossed over her chest, aggressively projecting that exact same toxic, entitled aura she always carried around like a weapon. "Julian," my mother said loudly, standing up highly dramatically with her arms outstretched exactly as if she were about to give me a loving maternal hug. "Sit down," I commanded sharply, my deep voice echoing powerfully in the large, acoustically tuned room. The absolute, unyielding authority in my tone shocked her nervous system so much she actually listened instantly, dropping heavily back into her plush leather executive chair with a stunned look on her face. "We really did not want to come all the way down here and interrupt your important work," my dad started, his voice gruff and slightly defensive. "But you left us with absolutely no choice. You are not answering any of our phone calls. We need to sit down as a family and sort some critical financial things out today." We already sorted absolutely everything out exactly 10 years ago when you violently threw me onto the freezing street, I replied coldly, standing tall at the absolute head of the massive table, completely dominating the space. I told Silas no. I told you no on the phone. Why exactly are you trespassing in my private corporate office? My mom's aging face tightened with familiar anger. We know we made some very unfortunate mistakes in the past, she said, quickly pulling out the exact same tired, manipulative script she always used. But we are still a family, Julian, and a real family has to stick together during hard times. We are completely desperate. The logistics business is totally failing. The commercial bank is actively threatening to foreclose on our residential house. The main warehouse, the delivery trucks, absolutely everything. Silas tried his absolute best to fix it, but the corporate debts are just way too massive to handle alone. You legally and morally owe us for raising you and feeding you. You have to give us a massive financial loan right now. I do not owe you a single solitary thing, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute zero temperature. You consciously chose Silas. You happily funded Silas. You blindly trusted Silas. And now you are rightfully paying the ultimate price for his sheer, unadulterated incompetence and your own staggering stupidity. My dad suddenly exploded, violently slamming his heavy fist down hard on the polished mahogany table. You arrogant, ungrateful little punk. We are your parents. We raised you from birth. We gave you a solid roof over your head. You are going to sit down, sign a massive check, and help this family out of debt right now, or I swear to God I will. Or you will do exactly what? I challenged fiercely, leaning forward aggressively, looking directly, fearlessly into his raging eyes. You will kick me out again? You will take away my part-time diner job? You will ground me? You have absolutely zero power in this building. Richard, you are nothing but pathetic beggars sitting uninvited in my corporate kingdom. Before my furious father could scream another threat, the heavy conference room doors opened gracefully. In walked Mr. Harrison, the incredibly intimidating, silver-haired senior CEO of the entire investment firm, followed closely by Beatrice, our absolutely ruthless lead corporate attorney. They were both wearing razor-sharp, incredibly expensive bespoke suits, carrying sleek leather briefcases. My parents looked wildly confused and suddenly very intimidated. Who exactly are these people? My mother asked nervously, her voice trembling as she suddenly realized that this was absolutely not just a private, screaming family argument anymore. I did not answer her directly. I slowly, deliberately opened the thick, heavy legal folder I had brought with me and purposefully tossed 3 massive stacks of stapled financial documents directly across the polished wood table. They slid perfectly, stopping exactly in front of my father's shaking hands. Mom, Dad, I would like to officially introduce you to Mr. Harrison, the senior CEO of this global firm, and Beatrice, our lead corporate counsel, I said, my voice echoing with pure, unadulterated, decade-long triumph. And I would highly suggest you take a very, very close look at those legal documents currently sitting in front of you. My dad suspiciously picked up the very first stack of heavy papers. He nervously adjusted his reading glasses on his nose. I watched his wide eyes rapidly scan the dense legal jargon and the bold corporate letterheads. I watched his face turn from an angry, flushed red to a stark, terrified white, to a sickening, nauseating shade of pale gray as the absolute reality of the words completely crushed his brain. What exactly is this? He stammered weakly, his hands visibly shaking so hard the papers rattled loudly against the quiet room. That specific document, Richard, Beatrice said sharply, taking a seat at the table and opening her own file, her voice like cracking ice, is the complete, legally binding transfer of your total corporate debt ownership. Your failing logistics company has been borrowing extremely heavily from aggressive secondary commercial lenders just to stay barely afloat for the past 2 entire years. Because your son, acting as CFO, explicitly defaulted on 3 consecutive, massive commercial loan payments. Those toxic debts were quickly bundled together and sold off at a steep discount to a private equity liquidation firm. I leaned heavily over the table, staring directly, mercilessly into my father's absolutely terrified eyes. And I personally manage that exact private equity firm. I am the lead executive director of the specific blind fund that just aggressively bought out 100% of your outstanding corporate debt. I do not just work in this building. I am your sole, absolute creditor. The silence that instantly descended upon the large room was so absolute, so incredibly profound, you could hear a tiny pin drop on the carpet. My mother loudly gasped, aggressively covering her open mouth with her trembling hand. My father looked exactly like he was about to suffer a massive heart attack and pass out right in his chair. The sheer, unimaginable magnitude of the plot twist completely broke their reality. They had arrogantly come here to manipulate their discarded, supposedly weak son into writing a desperate pity check, only to horrifyingly discover that their discarded son was the ruthless corporate executioner holding the massive legal axe directly over their entire financial existence. You secretly bought all of our debt? My mom whispered, her voice completely terrified. Why? To help us? To save the family business from the banks? I laughed loudly. It was a cold, incredibly hard laugh that held exactly 20 years of deep pain, rejection, and ultimate vindication. To help you? Absolutely not. I bought it specifically because it was a highly distressed financial asset that I could easily acquire for mere pennies on the dollar, and primarily because I deeply wanted to personally oversee the absolute, total liquidation of your fraudulent, pathetic company. You cannot legally do this to us? My dad yelled, standing up quickly, his voice completely cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. We are your own blood. You cannot legally bankrupt your own parents. It is entirely immoral. You bankrupted yourselves? I shot back instantly, my voice booming across the room with ultimate authority. You foolishly put an arrogant, lazy sociopath in charge of your money, and now I am legally calling in the massive debt. Every single cent is due immediately. The massive warehouse, the entire fleet of delivery trucks, the expensive office equipment, and the collateral you stupidly placed on your personal residential home. It is all legally mine now. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. My mother instantly started sobbing completely uncontrollably. Real desperate tears this time. The kind of incredibly ugly, messy tears born strictly out of absolute, inescapable consequences. She reached desperately across the wide table, trying to forcefully grab my hand. Julian, please. We are so incredibly sorry. We made a terrible, horrible mistake all those years ago. Please, I am begging you. We will completely lose the house. We will be homeless on the street. I looked coldly down at her reaching hand, and I felt absolutely, entirely nothing inside my chest. No pity, no lingering guilt, no remorse whatsoever. I know exactly what it feels like to be completely homeless and thrown out onto the street in the dead of winter, I said quietly, the heavy words cutting through the air like shattered glass. The only difference is, I actually survived it. Let's see if you can. The atmosphere in the massive conference room was suffocatingly tense, completely thick with the absolute despair of two people realizing their lives were entirely over. My parents were completely, fundamentally broken, openly crying and pathetically begging, entirely stripped of their usual toxic arrogance and unbearable entitlement. But I was absolutely not done yet. I had one more massive piece of corporate business to firmly take care of, one more absolute, devastating truth to forcefully expose before I permanently kicked them out of my life and my building forever. I looked calmly over at Beatrice, our lead lawyer, and gave her a sharp nod. She efficiently opened her sleek, black leather briefcase and pulled out another, significantly thicker manila file. She slid it smoothly and deliberately right across the polished table directly to my hyperventilating father. While our elite forensic accounting team was strictly auditing your company's financial books to accurately assess the total liquidation value of the business assets, Beatrice stated in a freezing cold, highly professional tone that completely commanded the room. We quickly uncovered massive, highly systemic financial irregularities spanning several years. Specifically, we found multiple, massive unauthorized cash withdrawals and entirely fraudulent wire transfers deeply hidden under the clever guise of fake, non-existent vendor payments. My dad slowly looked up from the table, aggressively wiping his heavy, sweating forehead with the back of his trembling hand. What exactly are you talking about? The global pandemic ruined our profit margins. The international supply chains completely dried up. We did everything by the book. The pandemic certainly did not help your margins, I interjected loudly, staring him down with absolute dominance. But what really, truly bankrupted your company was your precious golden child. Open the legal file, Dad. Look at the real numbers. His violently trembling hands slowly flipped open the heavy manila folder. Tucked neatly inside were dozens of official bank statements, aggressively highlighted international wire transfers, and clear, undeniable photographs of physical checks. Your perfect son Silas has been systematically, ruthlessly embezzling corporate funds for the past 36 consecutive months. I explained calmly, intensely watching my mother's tear-stained face contort in absolute, unadulterated horror. He absolutely wasn't paying your vital vendors. He was actively funneling the corporate capital directly into his own private, untraceable offshore accounts. Do you see that massive $90,000 cash withdrawal from last November? That absolutely wasn't for urgent warehouse roof repairs. That was the exact, precise down payment he used to buy his brand new, ridiculously expensive sports car. No, that is entirely impossible. My mom wailed loudly, aggressively shaking her head in complete, desperate denial. Silas would never, ever do that to us. He deeply loves this family. He was trying so hard to save the business. You are lying to frame him. Silas only loves Silas. I countered sharply, shutting down her pathetic delusion. We officially contacted Felix, his former logistics business partner. Felix got absolutely terrified of the impending federal audits and immediately handed over all the private communication logs and text messages to completely save himself from federal prison. Your precious, absolutely perfect golden child has been intentionally stealing your entire retirement money to lavishly fund his luxury lifestyle, and he was actively planning to flee the state the exact second the commercial bank foreclosed on you. My father just sat there frozen, completely, entirely paralyzed in his chair. The absolute reality of his entire miserable life was violently crashing down on his head. He had foolishly spent his entire adulthood blindly worshipping Silas, deeply alienating his highly successful sister out of pure, pathetic jealousy, and violently throwing away his youngest, most loyal son out of pure spite. And for what ultimate reward? To be ruthlessly robbed blind and left entirely destitute by the very child he spoiled and protected at all costs. And just in case you still have any lingering pathetic doubts about who your son Silas really, truly is, I added forcefully, pulling my personal cell phone out of my tailored suit pocket and setting it on the table. We also aggressively tracked down Fiona, Silas's recent ex-girlfriend. She was more than happy to formally sign a sworn, legally binding affidavit. I casually tossed the heavily notarized, printed affidavit directly onto the massive pile of devastating evidence. She legally, formally testified under oath that Silas openly bragged to her at a drunken cocktail party about exactly how he broke into my private laptop 10 long years ago. He explicitly, proudly told her exactly how he cleverly used Photoshop software to maliciously doctor those fake emails with Aunt Vivian to perfectly frame me. He honestly thought the entire situation was absolutely hilarious. He openly bragged to a crowd about how incredibly easily he manipulated both of you idiots into aggressively kicking me out onto the street, so he would absolutely never have to share a single cent of his future family inheritance. The heavy silence that quickly followed that massive revelation was entirely crushing, completely thick with the awful stench of totally ruined lives. My mother violently covered her face with both of her shaking hands, sobbing so incredibly violently her entire shoulders shook uncontrollably. My father just stared completely blankly at the far wall. His jaw completely slack, his eyes totally dead. The profound, inescapable realization of their own catastrophic, life-altering failures was finally, ruthlessly eating them alive from the inside out. They had literally, willingly destroyed their own family for an absolute fraud. You blindly believed a manipulative sociopath over your own loyal son, I said, my voice incredibly steady, completely, entirely devoid of the hot anger that used to totally consume my soul. You willingly threw me away like literal garbage. You proudly chose him over me. And now you are entirely, permanently stuck with the horrible consequences of that choice. My dad slowly, painfully looked up at me. His eyes were bright red, completely, utterly defeated. Julian, son, what exactly are you going to do to us? I am absolutely not your son, I replied instantly, ruthlessly cutting off that pathetic emotional manipulation before it could even fully start. I am the executive director of the firm that completely owns your massive debt. Beatrice will be officially, legally filing the total foreclosure and corporate liquidation paperwork at the courthouse tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. The federal authorities will also be receiving the complete, unabridged forensic audit regarding Silas's massive embezzlement and corporate fraud. You have exactly 30 days to entirely vacate the commercial premises before the locks are changed. My mother physically fell completely out of her large chair, literally dropping heavily to her knees on the expensive corporate carpet, desperately clutching at my expensive suit pants. Please, Julian, please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. We have absolutely nothing left. Where will we live? We are old and sick. You have to forgive us. We are a family. I calmly, deliberately stepped backward, physically forcing her to let go of my clothes. I looked coldly down at her pathetic, weeping form on the floor, vividly remembering the exact, cruel way she looked down at me 10 years ago when I was the one desperately begging for a coat on the freezing concrete porch. Aunt Vivian generously took me in when you violently threw me out, I said quietly, offering no mercy. Maybe you should go down to the dealership and ask Silas if you can sleep in the cramped back seat of his expensive sports car. I turned sharply to Clara, who was standing quietly, highly professionally by the conference room door. Clara, please immediately call building security and have these two trespassing individuals physically escorted completely out of the building. If they ever attempt to return to this property, have them formally arrested for trespassing. Without ever looking back, I confidently walked entirely out of the conference room, leaving them loudly, pathetically weeping in the total wreckage of their own terrible, unforgivable choices. The immediate aftermath of that explosive conference room meeting was incredibly swift, legally brutal, and completely undeniably absolute. True to my exact word, the massive private equity firm aggressively proceeded with the total, uncompromising corporate liquidation of their entire business. My parents' failing logistics company was completely, legally dissolved into nothingness. The heavy, expensive warehouse equipment was ruthlessly auctioned off to the highest commercial bidders, the massive fleet of delivery trucks were forcefully repossessed by the lenders, and the prime commercial property was aggressively sold to a massive, highly successful corporate real estate developer for a massive profit. Because they had incredibly foolishly used their own residential home as vital financial collateral for the massive business loans, the bank ruthlessly foreclosed on the large suburban house I grew up in. They literally lost absolutely everything they had spent their entire lives trying to build. Last I heard through the complicated family grapevine, they were forced to heavily, embarrassingly downsize, ultimately moving into a tiny, extremely run-down two-bedroom apartment on the completely bad side of town, living strictly, miserably off meager, insufficient monthly social security checks. Silas absolutely did not fare any better. In fact, his ultimate fate was significantly worse. The federal authorities eagerly received our highly detailed, undeniable forensic audit. He was aggressively, publicly investigated by federal agents for massive felony embezzlement, widespread corporate fraud, and highly illegal tax evasion. His precious, highly expensive sports car was legally seized by the government to pay off restitution. His private offshore bank accounts were permanently, entirely frozen, and he is currently actively facing incredibly serious, long-term federal prison time. He completely, selfishly abandoned my aging parents the exact moment the corporate money ran entirely dry, proving to the entire world exactly what I had known in my heart my entire miserable life. He only cared about himself. As for me, I absolutely did not actively celebrate their absolute, total downfall. I did not throw a massive, wild party or pop incredibly expensive bottles of champagne to mock their poverty. Honestly, the specific day the final corporate liquidation paperwork was officially signed by the judge, I just felt incredibly, profoundly tired. But it was a very good, highly healing kind of tired. It was the exact, peaceful exhaustion you feel deep in your bones after carrying a massive, suffocating, crushing boulder on your shoulders for an entire decade, and finally, permanently letting it drop heavily to the earth. I had officially, permanently severed the highly toxic family cord. I had successfully, ruthlessly enforced the ultimate, unbreakable emotional boundary. I absolutely did not need their pathetic approval, their fake, tearful apologies, or their highly toxic, draining presence in my entire life ever again. I was completely, profoundly, unconditionally free. A few short months later, as the crisp autumn air rolled into the city, I hosted a massive, incredibly warm Thanksgiving dinner at my spacious luxury penthouse apartment. The massive, beautiful dining table was completely covered in incredible, delicious food. The soft ambient lights were incredibly warm, and the entire room was completely filled with loud, genuine, deeply happy laughter. Sitting comfortably at that table absolutely wasn't the toxic biological family I was unfortunately born into, but the beautiful, incredibly loyal family I had actively chosen and carefully built for myself. Aunt Vivian was proudly sitting at the absolute head of the long table, smiling warmly, holding a delicate glass of highly expensive red wine, looking incredibly proud of the man I had become. Clara, my incredibly loyal, highly efficient corporate assistant, was happily there eating turkey with her wonderful husband. Mr. Harrison, my incredible professional mentor, was loudly laughing at a funny joke someone told. I stood quietly in the massive designer kitchen, looking out deeply at the incredible people who actually, genuinely respected me, who deeply valued my daily presence, and who supported me completely unconditionally. I realized right then, looking at their smiling faces, that the core concept of true family has absolutely nothing to do with shared, random DNA or matching last names. True, unbreakable family is strictly defined by mutual, deep respect, unwavering, fierce loyalty, and basic, fundamental human decency. My biological parents failed that massive life test absolutely miserably, but Aunt Vivian passed it with incredible, flying colors. The deep, agonizing trauma they inflicted on me didn't permanently break me. It successfully forged me into an unbreakable, highly successful man who knows his exact, undeniable worth. Sometimes the absolute worst thing that can ever happen to you, being completely abandoned by the very people who are biologically supposed to love you the most, turns out to be the ultimate, highly necessary catalyst for your greatest, most incredible success. If they hadn't violently kicked me out into the snow that night, I would have been permanently, hopelessly trapped in their highly toxic web, slowly suffocating in Silas's massive shadow forever. Their incredible cruelty was the painful, absolutely necessary push I desperately needed to step completely into my own incredible, unstoppable power. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own highly toxic family members? Have you ever had to establish a massive, unbreakable boundary to actively protect your own mental peace, your financial security, and your future happiness? Share your personal story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and please don't forget to like the video and strictly subscribe so you absolutely don't miss the next incredible journey. Thank you so much for deeply listening, and please always remember, your ultimate worth is absolutely never, ever defined by the foolish people who are way too blind to clearly see it.